6 months after President Obama's historic visit, how much longer will the United States continue its trade embargo on Cuba? And in our regular look at how technology is changing our lives, move over Beethoven, why composers could become redundant. I'm Martin Stanford. This is Insight. Welcome to Insight. For more than half a century, Cuba's revolutionary leader, Fidel Castro, has remained a thorn in the side of the United States. His socialist ideologies led to a trade embargo between the two countries that endures to this day. The United Nations is once again meeting to discuss that embargo, described by the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon as the most unjust, severe and long-lived system of sanctions ever applied against a country. In a moment, we'll speak to the UK's former ambassador to Cuba, John Dew. But first, here's Insight's Thawing.
With a simple handshake, more than half a century of icy relations began to thaw between Cuba and its neighbour in the US. The occasion, Nelson Mandela's funeral almost 3 years ago. The gesture between Presidents Obama and Castro clearly significant. The first gesture of friendship between the leaders since President Raúl Castro's brother Fidel led the Cuban Revolution in 1959. It was a 31-year-old Fidel who toppled dictator Fulgencio Batista that year with just 800 guerrilla soldiers, defeating the country's 30,000-strong army. Castro became a worldwide icon of communism, renowned for standing up to the world's biggest superpower. In 1962, he helped bring the world close to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Castro's invitation to host Soviet missiles on the island resulted in a 13-day standoff. Tensions had already been escalated a year earlier by the CIA-sponsored Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed military incursion on Cuba's west coast aimed at toppling Castro's government. The decades that followed saw a strict trade embargo imposed on Cuba by the United States, banning all exports and travel. It remains the most enduring trade embargo in modern history. Cuba today appears a picture of old world charm, a window into yesteryear. Visitors are charmed by the sight of classic cars, in reality a symbol of how this country has failed to keep time with progress elsewhere. But Cuba does have one of the world's highest literacy rates and offers free healthcare to all its citizens, something many countries don't, certainly not its superpower neighbour. Life under Comandante Fidel has not been easy, and sometimes for curious reasons. Sports like surfing were banned until recently because the regime feared Cubans would make the perilous journey to the US on their boards. And the kind of gadgets most of us take for granted, mobile phones, DVD players, and even toasters, were also forbidden because of a severe energy crisis.
The American government is still funding a number of regime change programs in Cuba, and it is still applying many of the aspects of the blockade. And as long as the blockade exists, then you haven't normalised relations. The things that really matter, for example, a cerebral stimulator can only be bought in America, and it's banned from sale to Cuba, which stops Cubans with Parkinson's disease receiving the necessary treatment.
This year, we saw the beginning of the end of the embargo, the first commercial flights from the US to Cuba since 1961. After half a century of tension, now the US and Cuba are engaged in diplomatic relations. Many hope it will blossom into a proper neighbourly friendship. Thawing, reporting for Insight.
Well, let's understand a little bit more about Cuba, shall we? I'm joined in the studio by the former UK ambassador to Cuba, that's John Dew. Ambassador, good to have you with us. 2004 you headed out there.
That's right, yeah.
What were your first impressions as you landed?
I think this is a strange and unusual place, like nowhere else. and it's been in a kind of bubble for 50 years. Being an island helps, of course, but it's somewhere quite special. I think it'll stay special, however much it changes.
In the sense that it may never catch up with the rest of the world?
I think it'll catch up, but whether it catches up and loses everything it's got at the moment, it's got some big achievements, as you heard earlier in the program: health, education, a sense of solidarity, but it is in desperate economic straits and cannot afford to maintain its current, what it would like to be able to do.
There's great latent potential there, isn't it? And nobody's prepared to take the lid off and let it flourish to whatever it can achieve, or at least the Americans aren't. Were you very aware of the American attitude to Cuba during your time there?
Well, I was there certainly, because it was much more confrontational. There was much more sort of stress on promoting the activities of so-called dissidents. Now it's much less confrontational. Of course, after the Obama visit in March, and I was there by chance when he came, there's more of a sense that it's calmed down. Nobody wants much stress or tension. Let's try and build on this, is the general view. Now, whether they can or not, nobody knows, because until the embargo, and that's sort of trade and investment and banking, you can't even use credit cards easily, and that sort of thing. Until that goes, we won't know what the full potential is. But with the investment from the US, with Cuban high level of education, know-how, it's quite a sophisticated country in many ways. Could be something quite special.
And do you think, in terms of the rest of the world saying to the States, this is something of an anachronism? Come on, you know, at UN level, they're trying to say to one another, surely now's the time to lift this.
Well,
does it fall on deaf ears?
It more or less, yes, of course it does, because it's a big domestic issue in the US. They've had this vote every year in the General Assembly since 1992. When they started, it was 79 against the US, 59 against the US, three for the US, and 70 abstentions. Last year was, what, 191 to 3. So the US is more and more in a corner.
Isolated.
Has never really, just shrugged it off, water off a duck's back. Last year there was some talk that maybe the US would abstain. Maybe the US would take the world by surprise and abstain. This would be a huge change in those sort of narrow diplomatic terms, but they didn't. This year, who knows?
And even if the US ambassador at the UN were to take instructions, let's go into the realms of hypothesis here, of that President Obama wants to make a symbol and ask them to abstain, the actual enactment of lifting the embargo would have to go through the American political system, through Congress, through the Senate, wouldn't it?
It would have to go through Congress.
And right now, that would never get passed. Do you agree?
Certainly not. It'll have to wait for a democratic Congress, I think.
And, well, let's go down that route of possibility then, seeing as we're in election season. We could end up, potentially, with a Democrat president, with a Democrat Congress, even a Democrat majority in the Senate. Do you think it would be an issue that might come to the fore then, or is it actually not that important as far as Washington's concerned?
It's not that important, but it can't go on forever. It's becoming a bit of a joke internationally. It can't go on forever, but it could only stop if there were that dream scenario you've outlined. So logic would say, well, if that scenario comes to pass, yes, they will do it. Because nobody really cares much about it, is my impression in the States.
Floridians do, perhaps?
Except for Cuban Americans and hardline Republicans. And it's very, very important in Florida. The Cuban American vote is still important. The Cuban American outlook on life has changed, but there's still enough people there to take it very seriously.
And in your time there, or since, do you detect a restlessness amongst the Cuban people that maybe they get a sense of what other people can enjoy, what society is like, what technology is like, what governments are like, and are restless for change? Or actually,
yes.
Are they quite peaceful about it?
Well, I think both. I think the national sport in Cuba is waiting. And waiting. They've been waiting a very long time.
They're very patient people, if that's the case.
A good cigar helps you wait, but nonetheless, waiting. But they are waiting. There's more confidence now that change is coming. I think the Obama visit was a sign that their waiting has not been in vain, that they've seen off so many US presidents over the last 60 years, and they're still where they are. So there was Obama coming to Havana in friendship, and not as a sort of bully or a boss or an adversary. Yeah. That's an achievement. So they think maybe waiting a bit longer. But of course,
at a societal level, there isn't a restlessness, there isn't a movement against the government, there isn't a sense of we don't like the way we are being governed at the moment.
I think there's a sense they don't like the way things are, because it is a very poor country in terms of income. I mean, in terms of what you get of education, health, and so on, it's not bad. But in terms of spending power, the average wage is well below $20 a month.
Right.
So now a lot of things are subsidized. It's not a disaster, but it's pretty hard to keep going on that. So there's a sense that things have got to get better, but nobody can quite see how. Those who are too impatient have left, and there are at least 2 million Cubans living abroad now.
Yeah.
And the number of people leaving has...
There must be chains of dialogue back from through families and so on. So actually over here, although I'm not doing great, it's a lot better than it was back home. But it doesn't seem to whip up an impatience for change.
I think nobody can see a way of changing that wouldn't lead to a breakdown. If everything is controlled by the state, if the state weren't there, there would be no food, there would be no petrol, things would stop. Yeah. So what people want is some kind of measured change over time. Because, as I say, if the state ceased to function, everything would stop. And people can see that. And in a way, the embargo has been quite helpful, because it gives us this idea of Cuba against the world. And the revolution has always been a very strong nationalist revolution. So the embargo, the sense of being under threat of a possible US invasion, which is still, until very recently, was still believed by most Cubans, that has kept them very much sort of loyal in a way, and nationalist fervor. When I was there in 2004, they were just finishing a huge bomb shelter 50 yards from my house. Now, that was in case there was a US invasion. Now, there was no chance of a US invasion, but the public felt reassured that there was this network of bomb shelters in case there were.
In case.
So that shows you how on an island you can think differently.
John Dew, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. This is Insight. Coming up, the composers in tune with developing technology.